Red Blood Cells. Chapter 1. Wine or Mahogany. David Olmann gripped the handrail while trudging down from the second floor of his motel. Rust and crumbling white paint stuck to his hand. His feet dragged against the grated steps, and heavy metallic groans filled the quiet night. The light of a single lamppost in the small parking lot flickered. Soft wind caressed his skin, bringing his mind back to Cassidy. For the past 2 days, he'd been exiled to the motel, unable to speak with or touch his wife. He couldn't be angry at her because he'd been too eager to spend time with Angela, his coworker, after they'd left work. He never noticed Cass following them to Angela's house. He should have been more careful. He stumbled past his car toward the liquor store a few blocks away. He'd run out of beer earlier that night and smoked a little bit of pot he'd bought. The only thing left to try and clear his mind of Cass was the tiny packet of powder the dealer had given him. David had told himself he wouldn't use it, wouldn't mix it in a glass of water as instructed. He'd never done anything more than smoke and hadn't been interested in anything else until 30 minutes ago when he gulped the concoction. The dark street tilted and swayed while David turned the corner on the sidewalk. He stepped over shards of broken glass which sparkled in the light of a street lamp. Losing his footing, he reached out and pressed his hand against a grimy brick wall to keep balanced. The longer he walked, the more his vision shifted, splitting for a second or two. Still, he marched on to his destination. Cass's bright blue eyes and lightly glossed lips haunted his thoughts. She always wore her hair in large curls which bounced around her shoulders. Though he loved her, after 7 years of marriage, she no longer gazed at him, no longer laughed heartily at his jokes, or admired his attempts to bring a smile to her lips. With Angela, those moments were more frequent, and David found joy so much easier. But Cass held his heart. He'd chosen to marry her. He'd be perfectly happy with her now if only she'd react to him the same way she had when they'd first met. After turning down another small street, a glowing liquor store sign beckoned from several blocks away. The words doubled and tripled in his vision, spun around one another, and then coalesced back into one. Out front, a group of men stood around, their silhouettes moving in front of the full-width window. Their rowdy southern drawls jumbled together. He quickened his pace, needing to get Cass out of his mind. A sense of failure gripped his heart. Pausing, he squeezed his eyes shut. A woman's clear voice drew his attention to the other side of the 2-lane road. "See you tomorrow." At the small building tucked in between 2 darkened stores, an open door spilled golden light onto the pavement. David squinted against the brightness. The woman continued down the sidewalk carrying a cardboard box. Just before the door closed, the light caught the edges of a cross hanging on the front, the brass glowing for a moment before disappearing in the dark. The liquor store light dominated the night again, but David remained still while staring at the church entrance. Flashes of childhood memories held him in place. 9 years old, looking up at his dad with tears obscuring his view. His dad swinging a belt, striking him below the knees, blow after blow until raw skin bled. Constant comparisons to his siblings, all perfect little sheep, until he felt lower than dirt and wanted to crawl up and disappear. The Bible thrust in his face, and his dad raising his voice to explain what a disappointment David had been. No matter how hard David had tried, how closely he'd followed scripture, it had never been enough. A growl tore from his throat. He stumbled away from the wall and into the street. Maybe his dad would be in there pretending to be perfect. David wanted to see that monster exposed. They hadn't spoken in decades, and the last David had heard, his dad lived states away, but anger and fury drove him towards the church. Halfway there, a car sped past him, almost clipping him. The blaring car horn barely covered up the shout, "Junkie!" David lost his footing and tumbled to the ground. His knees slammed against the asphalt, and sharp pain rocked him to his core. He slicked greasy hair out of his face. Pushing himself up, he mumbled under his breath and continued toward the darkened door. The pulsing pain in his knees drew up more hatred. David thought, how dare he? What gives him the right? Underneath his dirty old blue jeans, a sticky drizzle of blood trickled down his knees. With the pain coursing through his legs added to the tilt and sway of the world, he stumbled until he crashed into the door. He shoved it open and stood at the threshold. Across the room, past simple fold-out chairs padded with maroon fabric, a woman, in the middle of folding a blue button-up blouse, paused in front of the podium. Open cardboard boxes lined up in front of her. Light brown eyes searched him up and down. Shoulder-length and curly, her light brown hair framed her equally light brown face, as though she'd been created with a single tone. Despite her loose-fitting silver shirt, her Coke bottle figure stood out, especially in tight blue jeans. She looked around his age, maybe a little younger, in her late 30s. She reached out toward a younger girl who'd stopped mid-stride down the aisle, heading towards the door with a set of keys in her hand. Curly red hair cascaded down to the younger girl's waist. Her white capris with silver swirls down the sides made her look that much shorter. She looked to be in her late teens or early 20s. The girl pulled her toothpick-like arms into her petite body. The keys jangled while she stared at him with wide eyes. The woman whispered, "Come here," but the girl appeared frozen in place. David took the moment to scan the church. No decorations graced the cheap wood-paneled walls. Deep fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. To the right, a hallway faded into darkness. He'd never seen such a small church in his life. The woman paced down the aisle to the girl, who burrowed up into the side of the woman. For a moment, he saw his little sister reacting to their dad's angry outburst. The woman guided the girl back to the podium, never turning their backs to him. "What do you need?" she asked. David stepped into the church, and the door shut behind him. His knees throbbed, bringing his mind back to his anger. He asked, "Where is he?" "Who?" The woman maneuvered the girl back behind the podium. "That child beater!" He charged forward, ready to search every nook and cranny for his dad. The room tilted. He stumbled to the side and fell on top of chairs, scattering them across the floor. Metal bars slammed into his chest, his arms, his shins. Pain rattled his body. He rolled onto his back and closed his eyes. Darkness enveloped him. Up until this moment, he hadn't realized how tired he was. He only needed to rest a bit, and then he'd pull himself together. "Call the police," the woman said, her face fading into oblivion. David forced his eyes open and found himself sitting in a chair facing the podium. He prepared to stretch his arms, but rough rope tied his wrists together behind his back. The older woman sat in a chair in front of him, her face hardened. Hunched over with her elbows on her knees, a butcher's knife dangled between her fingers. The blade glinted in the golden light of the room, but her nails held his attention. Were they painted wine or mahogany? Based on the slightly darker tone, he'd say mahogany, although the lighting... The woman straightened in her seat and asked, "What's your name?" With a grunt, David forced his head up. Blurred vision cleared, and he focused on the heart-shaped face in front of him. Her stare softened, full lips tugging up into a gentle smile. "What did you take? Tick? Flacca? What?" The younger girl behind him asked with a soft voice. Why are you talking to the addict?" The woman glanced behind him and shrugged. "Cops will take their time coming to this neighborhood, so why not? Maybe we can help." She leaned back and crossed her legs. What made you think your dad was here? David wanted to laugh, but he couldn't find the strength. If she weren't clutching a butcher's knife, he would have thought this was a counseling session. He opened his mouth to say as much, but a long drizzle of drool fell before he thought to swallow. The woman's nose scrunched and her mouth curled so tight that it exposed teeth. Lovely. David licked his lips. Embarrassed as he was, he had to salvage this and get her interested in him. The more he stared at her, the more her beauty sharpened, etching itself into his mind. What color are your nails? He slurred out. Wine or mahogany? Her brows creased and head tilted to the side. The deep confusion in her eyes made him smile. Good. A woman loves a man of mystery. From somewhere behind him, the girl said, His brain's fried. It's not, he raised his voice to control the slur, but failed. To prove that his brain was fine, he forced his head up and back straight with a sudden jolt. The woman responded by brandishing the knife, holding it up high enough for him to see. As quick as he'd straightened, energy drained from his body. He slumped again, eyes closing, mind dimming. The promise the drug dealer had made kicked in, and he drifted off to where he needed to be, into thick darkness with no distractions, no thoughts, nothingness.